Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to come back again. It's been a very hectic season, campaigning plus, I've been assigned to two task force during the interim. So one is the Maritime Task Force, and then another one is the College Bound Scholarship Program. We're going to be meeting again this week on that initiative, which is to try to provide additional resources to lower income kids to go to college, provided that they can meet and agree to a certain number of terms. And so we're trying to really fine tune that program. So I'm very excited about that because it really touches a demographic of kids that are similar to the way that I grew up. We're talking about urban kids or lower income demographic kids that really need a second hand to get up, and it's a personal passion of mine. So very excited to continue to do that. And of course, we're in the swing of the campaign season. I know that Nathan and I have both been knocking on a lot of doors too. So I would say that since the last time we met, more people have gotten interested in the race. It's just a natural phenomenon of the campaign cycle that come October, people start to get more interested. And so a lot of people are talking to us about taxes. They want to know about what we're going to do to get the economy going, and most importantly, they want to know about education. And so those have been a lot of focuses and answering a lot of questions about those on the doors and how I want to approach that. What are the solutions that I'm offering? I hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of those solutions today.
Yeah, definitely top of our list too.
Well, and since the primaries, the last time we met, just working hard in all phases of lives, working on the campaign trail and outdoor belling, getting the walking shoes on, so that's always fun, building our team, working on our messages and fundraising, but also actually getting to work on issues again, ironically. As many of you probably saw, the psychiatric boarding ruling from the Supreme Court came down. And so I had worked on that through our ER and medical specialties, since I sit on both boards, and was thrilled with the Supreme Court at 8 a.m. and at 9 a.m. when they said they were going to release patients at 9 a.m. the next day, was a little less thrilled, and spent the next 2 weeks putting back together our work group, working with the governor's office and DOH to put together what's now the solution that we've got, which is releasing $30 million and building 150 beds. So even though I'm not down there, still working on issues and trying to solve problems, ironically enough, and a lot of the reason why I decided to jump back in. So I've been very excited to see that progress, and to see actually some folks getting help that are my patients right now. So working on all phases of life, and look forward to this last month where, while it's our life for 6 months, it's the rest of the world's for about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So it'll be a fun run to the end here.
One of the things that's happened since you were in here last time is they appointed a new head to the Washington State Ferries. And I don't know if you guys have had a chance to meet her and talk to her yet, but if you were sitting across from her right now, what's the one thing that you say, this is my priority, this is what I want you to start doing, or what I want to start talking about with you to try to start addressing some of these things that the public has some concern about over these last months?
Well, I think it's not just one thing. Unfortunately, with the ferries, they are a mess. It's accountability, it's efficiency, and it's stability in particular for us. The accountability with everything from the ramps, issues with the theft that occurred with a son of a senior official. It's the efficiencies that they have not really worked hard to implement. If you look at their budgets, they've cut costs but not actually done a lot of savings. And then it's stability for our community here. Again, rather than working to find savings in the budget and going through line by line and doing that like we did when I was in the Senate, working with them, their solution again is to propose cuts to the Triangle Route and to talk about how Bremerton is going to be cut again. And so my message to Lynn would be, just like when we talked when she was at Pierce Transit, that the first solution should not be to cut service. It should be to look at where we can find savings, and working to have that accountability that they've dug through their budget to really do that, and then to look at what runs may not be making sense, but do that in a fiscally responsible way first, and not just come looking for more revenue.
How do you come to that kind of a decision? How do you start thinking about the runs question?
I think you do look at the revenue question, how many dollars are coming in on that run versus the service, but also recognizing that there's a difference in costs. And I think we need to look at what supports the community and what's needed for the community. And if then we need new revenue after they've gone through and found savings, then that's something that we consider finding dollars in the embed account to support, because it is part of our marine highway system. And I think we've been cut, unfortunately, in Bremerton and the Triangle route pretty severely, and we need to, I think, keep the minimum amount of service we have.
Is Bremerton at that right now, do you feel? Because that's one of those that is subsidized.
I really feel like Bremerton is near the minimum of what is functional service for the community. Granted, it's not 103% revenue like the Bainbridge run is, but again, there you've got a run that's half the distance, but charging the same fare, so that's somewhat artificially inflated.
Easier for them to make.
Yeah, to make those kind of dollar, comparisons. So there are different runs that serve needs and shouldn't be eliminated solely because they don't hit 103%. And I think we look at where that service line is, and when we're talking about eliminating runs after 9 o'clock to Bremerton, where people can't go to games or jobs or the number of other things that supports, that's not the level of service they need. And so that's where we need to make sure we're supporting the runs. But we need to find those efficiencies where we can find the savings to make sure that we're getting that 56 or 63% up as high as we can.
So you'd be okay with proposing some elimination of runs?
I think we need to look at some of the runs. There's some in the island routes that have been looked at. When I was there, that was kind of the second line plan. Have we not found the savings? There's one run that hangs out pretty far on the island runs that is pretty costly. There's some issues about the summer season for the Anacortes run and whether or not taking that from, I believe right now it's 40 weeks of the year and shrinking it to 36 or 32. So those kind of things, there are some areas where we can sharpen the pencil and cut a little bit, but that's where we need to look at where that service is not being utilized as well.
Jesse, if you're sitting down with Lynn, where does the conversation start with you?
Yeah, my conversations tend to really track along a different pathway than I think a lot of normal legislators, because I come from such a industry where everything is project-based and where you have a lot of budgets that you have to be accountable to. So, and I also understand that she's stepping into a very political world at the moment because of the attention that's being paid to this. The very first question I would ask her is, what is her plan? And I would want to know the top 5 to 10 measurables that she's going to lay out for that plan beforehand so that we can track progress against them. Because typically a lot of what you see is just simply, what talking points, gosh, there's a little fly bugging around me. There's a lot of talking points around, well, what sounds good in the media, what would get pressed well, and we talk about runs, we talk about timings, but really, her predecessor was talking about the same things. Yet these problems that existed that led to his removal really are still going to exist unless we get a detailed plan that steps beyond politics. And so I'd want to know specifically what is that plan and what are the measurables to achieve it so that we can then hold her accountable in a way that is factually based. Now, from that standpoint, what I'd then move into is I'd really want to know, and this would be hopefully she sees this and knows it's coming because we will be meeting after the election. How can I serve her? She needs to be able to answer that question. I think that part of her job, part of any of these agency head jobs, is to know how the representatives, especially those that have a special interest in that field of endeavor, can serve them. How can we be partnering together? And I'd like to know that she's tried to answer that question too. I know what I can bring to the table and what I can try to do, but I'd like to have her perspective on that. If you combine those two together, really what I'm asking for is give me something that's more than just a hope and pray type of strategy that you get a bunch more money through a transportation package. Because oftentimes you see talking points with just the crossing the fingers hope that there's going to be more money coming down the pipe.
When you talk about measurables, you wanted to see on that from her. When the question comes to you guys in the legislature, are you going to fund this or not, or how much? What are the measurables that you think you use to make that decision?
Well, the first thing I want to know is I would go through and I would look at which of the departments within her purview are producing the least amount of efficiency and what she's going to do to turn those around. For example, we know that Representative Sequist and Representative Smith both signed a letter to the governor asking that the governor overhaul the entire leadership of the ferry transportation system. So from that standpoint, we know that there are inefficiencies there. So which ones is she going to address and which are the biggest priorities for her? Clearly, if you have a letter from representation that is asking for that big of an overhaul, she needs to address it. And I'd like her to dig into the details of that and tell me which ones. That would be the first place to start. If we are going to really prioritize which runs and which plans are going to be funded, then she needs to be able to step back and then come back and tell us which, in her mind, which are the priorities in terms of scheduling and timing, in terms of routes. And then I would step one further beyond that. I mentioned the transportation package. The other thing that she needs to be planning and I would want to see right now, is what is her long-term plan to interface with the transportation package? If we get that revenue, how does she want that to be shaped? When we go down and we start to negotiate that, it can't just be that we're trying to throw more money at the ferry system. It needs to be a strategic endeavor to approach this from a long-term perspective that says, in the whole scheme of the state transportation package, how is the ferry system going to be sitting in that capacity 10, 20 years from now? Are there potential other bridges that are going to be built? Is that even a possibility? If we're talking about a transportation package that will be in the billions, that should at least be something that's discussed, and she should put a priority to it and whether or not she thinks it's feasible. And then how would that affect the transportation package? Another thing that she needs to project would be, okay, given the trends that we did for one of the bills that I supported this year was allowing more flexibility to look at out-of-state bids for ferry construction. It was a bill that I was happy to help support that Representative Sequist ran. Is that going to decrease their cost projections for more ferries in the future? And what is that going to do in terms of the number of ships that we have in our fleet? And I want to know those types of things so that I can then ask her for her measurables on that so that we can put a real prospective plan in place. I mean, that's what I think the people of this district are electing me to do, is to be that safeguard for them and make sure that there's some accountability there that's measurable, as opposed to a political accountability talking point that you really can't measure, but you can kind of spin any which way you want to on an election season.
As we walk kind of closer to the legislative session, you've been kind of revised estimates on how much money for education you're going to need. The psychiatric decision also, something kind of new has come up. Some of these things are coming a little bit more clear. When you talk about transportation, whatever's going to be negotiated next session, are you still in a place where you do support a gas tax as being part of that? And if so, what kind of level do you think is appropriate, or is that completely off the table and you have to look somewhere else? Where are you at on that?
It is not completely off the table with me, but I have a high hurdle for a starting point. I just this morning met with the Association of Washington Business to talk about some of their needs. And wouldn't you believe that a lot of the business industry is very, very acutely focused on the transportation package, because they realize, they realize that if our transportation system continues to degrade, it's going to hurt and impact all areas of business. And so it is a very highly prioritized need that we need to address. So with that said, where does my hurdle start with? That hurdle starts with two caveats. Number one, for any of the cost projects that King County has right now, they have to agree to, within the county itself, fund any more overrides on it. So for example, I think we've talked about this previously, but if you look at the supplemental transportation package that was proposed this year, there was no appetite for raising taxes to provide additional money. A lot of the money that was being asked for in that package was to cover cost overruns on the 520 floating bridge project. These are overruns, the second slew of them. How often is the rest of the state going to continue to fund overruns because they can't get their job done correctly and manage that project correctly? Now, because there was no appetite for taxes, what did you see happen? Every other district outside of King County was hurt as a result of it, because what they did to find the money was pull money from other projects outside the district. I'll give you an example. The Purdy Bridge is under a routine maintenance system. If you go and drive across the Purdy Bridge right now, you'll notice that about a fifth of the way across, you can see where they stopped the repainting project. Why? Because they quote-unquote right-sized every other project outside of King County. And they took the additional revenue from those projects outside of King County and then gave it to King County to cover their cost overruns. Why should we be rewarding such dereliction of duty and inefficiencies in terms of getting their jobs done? So if you want to see me support a transportation package, especially a raise in the gas tax, then what has to happen is King County has to agree to cover their cost overruns. I'm not saying that we're not going to fund any new projects that King County needs. That's going to certainly be needed to increase our economy as well and get our transportation system fixed. But the overruns have to start to be accounted for by King County so that we know that the revenue that we are voting into place through a tax increase is actually going to go to benefit everyone in the state, especially since I'm representing this district. That money will come here. And certainly, if we want to talk about funding ferries, what do you think the likelihood is that we're going to have all the revenue that we need if King County keeps siphoning off all the money that we'd vote into place? So that's a very high sticking point that I have. If we can agree to that, then I'm on board. Then we can start talking.
There was a second, or was that the one?
No, that's fine.
Okay.
So I think it's still on the table. I think people are talking about it. I think it's going to be a challenge. You know, in addition to the Cleary decision that you identified in psychiatric boarding, the class size initiative is another huge dent in the budget, upwards of $4 billion if it passes. And I think it looks like all accounts, I haven't heard anybody that's talked about it not passing. So I think we've got huge challenges there, but I think there's a broad coalition across business, labor, environmental groups that want to see a number of these things done. And so I'm willing to look at a package if it, again, supports our district. I was clear 2 years ago, and I'm clear today about what that means for our district. That means stable ferry funding. It means capping the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. It means addressing the Belfair bypass and 167, which, while not in our district directly, have a real impact on jobs in our community, or the Kitsap area, economic development area, as well as the port down in Tacoma that a lot of our residents in Gig Harbor work at. So, you know, those things have to be a part of the conversation. If they're not, as a part of the Ferry Caucus, as well as the Pierce County Coalition, I wouldn't go along with talking about that. I think we also need to look at some efficiencies in there. There's the out-of-state bid issue. It's one, but I do generally support the build in Washington, but it needs to be competitive. I think the other thing we need to do in terms of these mega projects is look at moving towards more design build. The challenges on 520 as well as on the ferries were because, again, they were in-house designed at DOT and then translated out from build, and the errors were made inside of DOT, and as a result the state's liable for them. In contrast to some of the challenges that you're seeing on the tunnel, which was the design build, which is now still under the initial warranty of the tunneling machine, and there's some liability on the contractor, arguably based upon the way the contract was constructed. So I think more design build contracts that, you know, have a fair approach to that cost sharing, but really do try to prevent these errors from happening that are driving up our costs artificially. And, you know, not going back to the drawing board. You know, we took an off-the-shelf ferry and redesigned it and changed ramp levels and things like that I have yet to understand exactly why that served any purpose other than to make it look like our other ones. And at some level, there's a cost versus prettiness factor that needs to start coming into these conversations, and we need to pull back on some of those. So I hope we'll move towards more design build approaches in it, and that we do get the projects that the district would need.
What other, do you want to?
Well, I would note too, I mean, a lot of what Nathan just stated there are good things to put in place. Again, I would note that the hurdle needs to be set in place that King County covers its cost overruns, because even with some of those efficiencies, we can still see revenue stripped away from our district and from our other non-King County projects. For example, the tunnel dig in Seattle. That is a design build type of project, and yet we are still looking at having to fund cost overruns on it, even though it was design build. Why? Because usually when these projects are done, the contractors are very specific in how they write their contracts. In this case, we still have a total of $170 million, $180 million still outstanding that's being litigated right now as to whether or not the state of Washington has to pick up what they're calling a scope increase, or what the state of Washington is arguing is that they didn't do their job correctly. Now, the state's already funded $30 million of scope increase. That's under a design build program. So when we sat down in our last Joint Transportation Committee in DuPont, the state tried to espouse that they were $170 million in the black. Yet when we really went down and looked at the details, and if you look at the TVW recording of that, after some additional specific questions about their budget, I got them to admit that they were really looking at $10 million in the hole. So not only do we have the potential, design build is good, but even with that, we still have the potential to have cost overruns, siphon money away from other non-King County districts. That's why that caveat is so important, because even under that paradigm, the state could still be liable for it. And it's a very important thing.
Who should negotiate the contract with the construction firms then?
What's that?
Who would negotiate?
Well, right now the Department of Transportation
Right,
takes that on.
But wouldn't King County have to do that then?
Well, in this case, I would ask for a stipulation that simply says, regardless of that, I mean, you can get into the details of all that negotiation, and you've got different layers of government trying to get involved, and that typically only hurts the process.
Which is the complication in this deal, if I understand it right.
But in this
Hard to
case,
legislate it out.
I'd rather have that continue to be managed from the Department of Transportation, because it's a single source for accountability with regard to the level of efficiencies within contract negotiation. But in addition to that, I would simply say a caveat. If you've still got it wrong, King County is going to cover those cost overruns if it's in that county. That way, it's an additional layer that's not tied
Right.
together so that you can review it in individual capacities and truly get some progress on it.
And I think what you're trying to say, Jesse, is more about the mega projects, because these types of projects are throughout the state. It's not just King County. I mean, 167 is going to be probably a large part of any next package, and I would assume you would advocate that the same accountability should be on our county as well if there's overruns and things like that. The issue is accountability for the projects and not, I think, a county specific issue. And in particular, I think you're referring to tolling projects. The issue is that, one county shouldn't take precedent, but on a lot of bases, actually King County is a net exporter of dollars. And in the next package for our district, if it goes through that we cap the tolls, that we get a bell fare bypass and a 167 and stable ferries and the things that most of us are looking at, we'll be a net importer of dollars. So I'd be careful picking on any one county, because each package is different with the needs of the districts and the needs of the state. And so, the issue is mega projects and cost overruns, and how do we control that cost?
That's kind of an interesting point, and actually, I think that's a good question. Like, should that concept, which, I can definitely see the reasoning. Say, you guys messed it up. It's good for you. You should help out. Should it apply when Spokane does a project, when Clark County wants to build a bridge? With the same, do you think the same philosophy?
It's a fair question, but let's look at the reality on the ground. You might say that they're the same, but our counties are not the same. As a matter of fact, King County has benefited time and time again from continued cost overruns. So it's not an equal or even a level playing field to start with. King County is already this far up in terms of taking money outside of just this year. I just gave you the Purdy Bridge example. Look at the repaving on Highway 16.
No, I understand that.
So we're starting in the hole. So I would give you that as a precedent to answer the question that Nathan poses. Should the counties be treated the same when in fact they're not the same? King County's mega projects will dwarf the combined sum of the other projects in the state. Now, 167 will start to bring that back, but mark my words, by the time we're done with Big Bertha in Seattle, the potential effect on revenue in this state is going to be tremendously exceeding any other project in the state outside of King County. And when you combine that together with the 520 project, King County is in a class by itself. So why would I want to treat Spokane County or some other county in Southeast Washington the same as King County? They're not the same. That's one of the benefits of having stronger local governance to begin with, which I'm a huge advocate of. Because to say that there's a one-size-fits-all and that whatever is good for King County is good for the rest of our district has proven to only hurt the smaller counties because of King County's size. And so now that's a difference between Nathan and me. Nathan has voted lots of times, we've talked about this before, he tends to support the Democratic caucus, which is centered in Seattle. I'm going to stand up against that. And so no, I don't think we should treat Pierce County or Kitsap County the exact same as King County. They are different. You're electing us officials to dig into the details and understand those differences and come up with legislation that is pertinent to each individual player in that scenario.
Okay, here's another question about, this is also about revenue and potential taxes, because there was that meeting over in, I think it was Whidbey Island, or no, Chehalis, excuse me. You guys read about that Inslee spoke to the group and they started talking about a carbon tax or a cap and trade system and possible revenue that's come through. And there were some Eastern Washington Republicans who were saying, yeah, we would be willing to do this if we start to address some of our flooding issues. And then there's Puget Sound legislators who said if we can pay for stormwater projects, things like that. Putting that into some sort of package that comes from the cap and trade system. And Inslee even hinted maybe this is something that would then put money into education. The task force that is going to say some things in November that you guys would then deal with in the next coming session. But what do you feel like about, I know there's no details on this cap and trade quite yet, and so I'm not asking you to address something like that. But in general, is this something that you think is realistic to look at, not only for the money it could bring in, but also some needs which, from this initial appearance, are spread around the state, addressing things kind of equitably, Eastern Washington and Western Washington, not just over here?
And I think, there's an obligation to listen to anything that's bipartisan. I have severe reservations about us going this alone on a cap and trade type system, as I think it creates a lot of economic changes in the market. The intent of the environmental projects, of the transportation issues, of education, are all good and noble goals. I'm concerned about Escalades alone, but there's a bipartisan interest in exploring it, and I'll listen to them. And if it's a better solution than a gas tax or an embed or anything like that, I think we should look at it. But at least in its initial stages and the proposals that we're talking about with the impact it would have on our small businesses, I don't see it working. But I'll keep an open mind.
I'm glad to hear Nathan say that. I think that's a good starting point. Yeah, you always want to listen, but I can tell you from the listening that I've already done, what you're seeing here is a system that's being propagated that doesn't address the current problems that we have in our current funding mechanism. And again, I'll come back to the caveat that I just said with regard to the transportation package. But if you'll look at what happens inherently down in Olympia, the budgets are all negotiated in private, behind closed doors. 80% of the legislature for any given one of those budgets doesn't participate in that process until about 3/4 of the session is done. And as a result, there's not a lot of transparency in that process. Now, what you're advocating for here, and you just mentioned two of the areas where Republicans are potentially supporting this, and I have concerns over that. I'm willing to listen. But from the listening I've done, okay, what you're saying is, okay, the governor's willing to create some brand new tax on the people of Washington, a brand new model that's going to have its own problems in implementation and have a huge cost to the state in trying to implement and have a huge impact on business and individuals, by the way. For a political trade with Eastern Washington, why should Eastern Washington have to trade for some new tax just to get their normal transportation needs addressed in the first place? See, under my caveat of capping for cost overruns, King County, they would get their normal needs taken care of anyways, which is the way it's supposed to work. We should be addressing the inefficiencies that we have now before we start talking about a new tax. So that's one trade that they're asking for, and the other trade that they're asking for is, well, greater flood protection in the Centralia area in terms of getting this carbon tax. And what it on the outside looks like is that you're seeing a huge political behind the scenes trade being negotiated for an additional tax in the state of Washington. I would venture that's why Nathan is right to be reserved about it, and that's why I'm reserved about it. I would want to know more of the details to make sure that something behind the scenes isn't getting negotiated for a trade that should be normal course of business for the state of Washington, especially if it's going to put more taxes on the people of the state.
What, in that whole, I don't think we really talked about this last time you guys were here, but I was being specific on that thing, but the idea of this task force looking at climate change issues that Inslee got going, what are the things that you say, yeah, that's what I'm glad he's looking at, I'd like to go along with this? What are the things that you think are realistic to start addressing sooner rather than later, as far as knowing where the governor's interest is on that issue?
In terms of climate change?
Yeah.
Well, I've mentioned this before, and it wouldn't have necessarily seemed as though it fit into the environmental, but I'll draw the connection to you. One of the things that I'm proposing for additional revenues in the state is to take back management of federally owned lands by the state, so that we have the administrative influx of revenue that would come just from administrative efficiencies that we have. But it has a huge environmental impact, and as a reference point, I'll point to the fires that we had during the summer in central and eastern Washington. Those fires started and occurred on federally managed lands, which are managed at a much lower level of efficiency than what would have been the case if they were managed by state agencies. And in that case, think of all the environmental damage that was caused. Global warming, carbon released into the atmosphere as a result of those fires that could have been prevented had the state been managing those lands at a better level, and we could have prevented the fires to begin with and actually helped bring revenue into the state, especially if we're clearing up all the potential tinder that just falls on the ground that currently the federal government won't let us go in and clean up.
How does the trade work with, if the state started managing this, how do they have enough resource to do that? What's the trade-off?
Why wouldn't we have the resources to do that? Because we're going to generate revenue from it. For example.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by generate revenue?
Oh.
We're going to sell it?
Sell the land?
Yeah.
No, of course not.
How are we going to generate revenue?
Okay, the same. Here's one package that I'll point you to. In fact, Commissioner Gelder just wrote about this, and I'm surprised you don't know about it, because it's supported by Patty Murray, by Derek Kilmer, by Maria Cantwell, and it's a similar package off of revenue generated by state-owned lands that carves out certain fees that you allow industry to come in and manage. And in this case, what they're supporting is one that supports additional trails being built in counties and green space. Why not follow that same model for the funding of additional revenues for schools, for example? I just mentioned that in an interview I just did with one of the reporters from the Kitsap Sun a couple days ago. And that's a legitimate package. I don't care that it's a Democratic starting point, start there. It's working for green space and for environmental purposes. Why not use it for funding education? And it starts with taking more ownership of state-owned lands, or of state land, and bringing it under the purview of the state. And from that standpoint, use as the model the very system that Maria Cantwell, Patty Murray, and Derek Kilmer supported. And then when we let private sector, or if we want to have the state do it, I'm willing to consider it. But why not start there and then let private sector come in and say, you know what, all the fallen timber, let's get that out of here so it doesn't burn up. And then we'll take a fee off of the revenue that you generate from that, and then we'll fund schools. Or in this case, and not only do we have to fund schools, but we can better manage the land in addition to that. The revenue is self-producing. I mean, and you can start with a democratic model. This isn't a Republican and Democrat thing.
No, I just didn't understand how that worked.
And so from a standpoint of the polarization that usually happens when you talk about environmental issues, where the Republican is usually tried to be pitched as the guy that doesn't want to care about the environment at all, which I think is absurd. I have 5 kids. I want them to benefit from all the natural resources of this state. I love how beautiful it is here. I mean, if you had to describe what makes Washington unique, it's the blue, gold, and green. I mean, I work down in California a lot, and they've sure got a lot of gold, and they've got some blue in the water, but they've got no green. It's the unique, it's that purpose, and I want to honor this environment as much as anybody. And this solution that I'm proposing could be started with, and I'm willing to start it with, a democratic proposal. Yet typically in talking points, my opponent, even by the nature of, well, how are you going to fund it? Well, he should have known, because it was a democratic proposal I'm starting from. Yet he wanted to polarize this to make it seem, well, I'm the traditional Republican and I don't care about the environment because I'm looking for an additional source of revenue from state-owned lands. Now, I'll also point you back to another funding source. If you look at the uptick of levies and bonds for supporting school initiatives or school funding, you'll notice that those started to have an uptick the moment that the Spotted Owl case was settled and the state stopped producing revenue from timber from some of its lands. Now, subsequently to that, science has shown that it wasn't state mismanagement of those lands that was hurting the Spotted Owl, it was the barred owl. Yet all that revenue got lost, and then the state never properly funded education as a result of losing that revenue. Schools started to suffer. And then you saw more local initiatives and bonds come up, and now we've got a huge initiative at the state level to try to fund it that has a lot of provisions that even the governor doesn't support. So from my standpoint, this takes us back to a model that was already proven to work in the beginning. So not only does it have democratic support, it also has historical support for working. This is a real solution that we should be looking at. And it would help the environment too.
An interesting approach. So I guess I'm interested to hear now that you think that climate change is a concern. That hasn't been what I'd heard from your congressional campaign, so I'm glad.
I may differ on climate change with you, but I certainly agree with everybody that trees burning wildly in our forests at the state level is not a good thing. That's a true environmental thing that we need to address. And I think it's ridiculous that you would assume that I don't support trying to correct that.
I didn't say that, Mr. Young.
You just did.
I said I'm glad to hear your position on climate change has evolved, but I guess I overestimated what you had said. Again, I guess this idea of, because that was the original question, was climate change. So let me answer that, and we'll get back to some of these trails ideas. So on climate change, I do support the governor's work on a number of things. Ocean acidification is something that directly impacts our community. We look at Hood Canal, a huge issue there. Our sports fishing population, again, a huge issue. Working on better management of lands, whether state or federal owned, is a reasonable approach and something that does have merit. Whether or not that's done through some of the proposals is a different issue. And also, I think this is, when we link back to the economy, this is a bigger issue in that there's the green economy that is getting up and running, the solar industry, some of those types of things that we can play a part in and bring jobs to our community. So when we ask how do we interface the environment and the economy, it's to that job growth and being a part of that green economy. Because while some people don't believe in climate change, maybe at this table, I guess, still.
Did I say that?
I'm not certain where your position is. I haven't heard it yet. But whether or not you believe it.
But you're willing to speak about it.
I'm still looking for an answer. But whether or not you believe it, the rest of the world's investing trillions of dollars into it. And so it's like passing up Microsoft in the 1970s to me. This is a piece of the global economy, and we have an abundance of resources to be able to play a lead role in that manufacturing that are both great paying manufacturing jobs, but based off of renewable energy like hydro here.
So what's the state's role in doing that, do you feel? What would you be willing to promote?
So I think then that gets into the whole economic development conversation. We have 10,000 potential jobs here at Kita around the airport. If we can get the Belfair bypass and work on some econ development there are those kind of models with Fredericksburg and elsewhere. And so I think there's a whole package. It's us going out, and the governor being a part of that conversation and recruiting those businesses, working to make sure that we have that renewable, consistent energy so that they have price stability when they're looking at it, like we've been able to do with carbon fiber plants that are east of the mountains. So those types of projects to do whole economic development, but I think we should be aggressively going after this industry because I think it both fits our environmental goals, but is a great source of sustainable, great wage jobs for our citizens, and is going to be, I think, arguably the next big industry over the next 30 years is coming from this sustainability issue and from working on some of these environmental concerns. In terms of the issues of the federal to state land conversion, the Trails program I don't think is a giant revenue source. In fact, the state invests significant dollars out of its capital budget to build many of those trail systems. And the idea is that you'll get tourist dollars back from it. That direct correlation has been tenuous sometimes, but it's a great idea. I don't think it's the massive revenue proposal, and what I heard from you was that you wanted to go back and work on the timber industry and reopening some of those lands to more aggressive management, which is what you've said before in the past.
No, I never said that. I said I was willing to start from a democratic starting point,
Which
is what I said.
Doesn't include logging, but...
Let me ask you, so from that standpoint, you say that no revenue. How much money did it cost the state to fight those fires? And had we prevented it, could that money have gone to education?
So I believe it cost a couple of $1 million. It could have gone to education. We have forest fires every year, and there's no amount of land management that will prevent some forest fires.
Well, so you've given up before you even start. You're not even willing to consider it.
No,
That's what it sounds like. You just said we can't even address it.
No, that's not what I said. What I said is anybody who does cost management knows that there is a curve on prevention where you get out to a non-sustainable cost. In medicine, we call it a Starling curve. But
yeah, we talk about that in business too. But you just said you weren't even willing to address it. So what's the point? Give me the point. If you're going to say it's not even a starting point, give me the fact that says it isn't.
Well, wait a second. What we're trying to figure out is you propose something that says, I feel there's money to not only be saved, but there's also money to be made. You didn't give us a figure on what that was, but you said this is where I'm willing to start and start talking about it. You're saying, I understand this proposal, but there's not, if I understand what you're saying there's not a significant amount of money to be made in doing this that would make a difference.
In the way that it's proposed in the Democratic bills about the Trails program, there's not a significant amount of dollars that have been identified. The ones that are more related to economic development and tourist growth than they are to management fees and administrative use of the lands, I believe, as it was phrased. And so unless you're talking about going in and doing timber harvesting and mining and some of those other things, which people have proposed in that.
Okay, hold on there real quick answer. Are you talking about timber management, mining, that sort of stuff?
My initial point has always been on the administrative cost gains. Secondarily to that, I have then mentioned that from a Democratic starting point relative to the Trails bill that Democratic leadership has supported, we could use that as an additional revenue source. And in addition to that, we could also look at these other things. Now, what I didn't say go ahead and make money off the harvesting. I simply pointed to a historical model that did work, and once removed, caused a huge gap in terms of funding for education. That's what I pointed out. Now, are you saying that we shouldn't harvest any potential trees from, what about the fallen trees? Should we go get those out of there so we don't have forest fires? Wouldn't that be a good source of revenue?
Well, actually, a lot of the timber industry will tell you that those have mold indicated.
They will not tell you that. In fact, you obviously haven't talked to them. Because I'm getting asked to get in there and go get them.
So I think there's a point in doing aggressive
Have you
forest
talked to the
management.
timber industry?
Yes.
You just avoided my question. How can you say that they wouldn't want it when they clearly do?
There are times for active management where you can make revenue off of it. Some of it is not.
So now you're agreeing with me, but you just disagreed with me.
I said again, I don't think that's the large source of revenue that you're talking about, and
You're answering a different question.
But we're trying to figure. But what we're really trying to figure out. I mean, this is silly that we would
Yes.
argue over who has talked to who. What I'm trying to get a handle on is what your priorities are. How do you think we address? The governor is going to start throwing stuff at the legislature next year. There's this task force that's going to have some ideas. How do we handle? Yeah, forest fires are an environmental issue. I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
Hood Canal and what you said, that's an environmental issue. And so I'm trying to get a sense of what's at the top of your priority list. I think you were pretty clear. This is at the top of my priorities. I was just trying to drill down a little bit what exactly you meant by that. I completely understand it, and you're saying, and I actually would like you to finish this thought, you're trying to say, you don't think there is that much revenue to be found there.
Not at the first scratch down
But
level
is
of
it
the
something,
democratic
is
vote.
it an idea you like, or is it an idea?
I'm willing to explore it. I'm willing to talk about it, but I don't think that reopening our lands that have been put into trust to keep trails and turning them into a revenue source is necessarily the first place we should look. I think there are other things we should be doing, and that's not at the top of my priority list. I think we should do things like the Trails program because those are good ideas to do economic development. But the revenue that comes off of that is more from economic development and tourism than it is from the actual lands in the way that most people talk about that.
Okay.
Until you get to the second phase of now I'm going to expand it to mining and drilling and other uses of the lands, that's where bigger revenue dollars are attached to this idea.
And is that a place where you would ever be willing to go? I mean, it sounds like you would be open to the talk.
I'd be open to the talk, yes.
Is that a place where you would ever be willing to go?
I'd be willing to listen. It's not a starting point that I think that most people are at in the state that have grown up here.
Follow up on where we're going with this kind of tourist dollars. There was also the announcement just this week, this kind of proposal to put taxes back on bottled water, something on motorhome registrations that would go specifically to the tourism industry in Washington State, which in Kitsap County, that's all we've heard for the last 2 years is everyone, this is going to be a future economic driver of ours. Do you believe it is? For us, for the 26th district, do you think that's an important thing to put in the priority list as far as creating jobs and creating things? And is this a way to do it? I'll let you just continue.
Simple answer, yes, I believe tourism is a big part of our area inside of Kitsap County, but also into the peninsula. I think it is a decent piece of it. A lot of people come here for our environment and for being part of it. Do I believe that bottled water taxes and motor vehicle home taxes are the necessary logical link to that? No, I think it's a bigger conversation that we have, and it should be part of the budget. We used to have an Office of Tourism. We used to have connections back to the direct marketing industry that got eliminated in the budget, I believe 4 years ago now, that should be part of, as we're growing out of this recession, rebuilding some of the things that actually helped our state economy. We have bigger conversations to have about education, about healthcare, about other challenges in economic development, and lining up taxes for these small programs and having this conversation, I think is distracting from those issues. We need to have that as a part of a holistic budget conversation, but trying to do one-offs, I think, is not an effective way of management. It doesn't work in the long run. It hasn't worked historically as things have gotten moved around, as those things get changed in budgets. So I think we need a long-term conversation about the stability of the state budget, where we're going in terms of revenue, where we're going in terms of expenditures, that has to do with the large line items, not the roughly $1 to $2 million that a tourism office has had in the past budgets. I think we're kind of in the weeds rather than on the main issues right now.
I think that was well said, to be honest with you. Yes, tourism is important, but I can tell you as a kid that grew up poor and homeless, there's no way I'm going to put a tax on those types of commodities that a lot of poor people rely upon. And more importantly, that the people of our district have said no to so staunchly in the past. This idea of one-offing taxes that way to solve for these individual issues is only going to put more of a burden on our middle and lower class. As a kid growing up, I mean, oftentimes some of the access to water that you have through public facilities, whether you're in an apartment complex where the piping isn't all that great, it's hasn't been updated and could be potentially dangerous to your health. Bottled water is a good resource to be able to get and cheaply, so I wouldn't put a tax on that because it would disproportionately hurt poor and lower middle class.
Okay, let's shift it over. Let's shift it over to education a bit. We talked a lot about this the last time you guys were here, but one thing that developed since you were here was the Supreme Court holding the legislature in contempt and not saying exactly what they're going to do. I know I think there's a committee meeting today, in fact, and talking about exactly how that's going to work. If you were the Supreme Court right now, how do you think is a good way to make sure the legislature follows through and comes up to the levels through 2017? What do you think is a fair way to say, guys, this is how you're going to get it done, or else what we're going to do to you? I know, they've said extend the session. They've said put you on jail. I don't think that's realistic. But if you were the one to say, here's the way we lock down and make sure, absolutely certain they follow those mandates. What would you suggest?
Well, if I was Supreme Court, I would have never voted to put us in contempt in the first place. There's a clear check and balance here. None of these Supreme Court judges were ever elected to address education. That's our job, and they need to understand that. From our standpoint, for them to come back and they want to reference some potential standpoint or statements that the state has made in the past, some potential funding sources in the past, but then to come back and say that we're not funding it enough is clearly a dereliction of their duties, and they're not in a position to understand these issues. They're elected to go solve legal cases. They're not elected to even understand the amount of time, all the players that come into addressing education, and I think it's an extreme level of arrogance for them to think that they're in a position to try to mandate to us how we should solve this. This is the state legislators' purview, and for them to say that we're in contempt, I find them in contempt. I think that's a waste of their time. They should be addressing real cases before them. Now, from that standpoint, I don't believe that education is properly funded. But that's what people are electing me to go figure out and take care of for them, not the Supreme Court. Now, in terms of trying to get proper funding for our schools, yes, I understand. I'd challenge any one of the Supreme Court justices to understand the technology gaps that we have in our school systems and the varying differences in municipalities and in rural areas versus urban areas with regard to teacher flexibility, with regard to administrative ability to address mental health issues within schools, and then try to understand how that would fit with a top-down federal government mandate on teacher evaluations. It's not their job. They spent a few hours trying to legislate whether or not the state's paying enough into it and don't even understand the issues. That's our job. That's why we go out and meet with teachers. I know Nathan's met with them. I've met with them too. The legislature is the place to solve this, not the Supreme Court coming down and telling us how to get it done or under what circumstances or guidelines we should do it. That's not their job. They have no context for it. And I think it's a huge starting point. I think they made a mistake by trying to say that we're in contempt. The fact of the matter is politics does get involved here. If you really want to address education, then you'll fund it first. You'll put it into its separate budget. We've talked about this before. This is not a Republican and Democrat talking point. In every industry in the world, you have accountability over the budgets that you maintain. Yet in the state of Washington, we have no accountability for that budget. The fact of the matter is that budget is negotiated behind closed doors and is embedded into the operational budget. 80% of the legislature does not see those negotiations going on, which means that 80% of the people of this state are unrepresented when it comes to how their educational dollars are funded because their representatives are not part of the process. So here we have a schedule that's set before the legislature where 3/4 of the time that budget, the governor proposes something, the leadership of those committees get together, and they start looking at it behind the scenes, and they'll either start with that as a starting point, or they'll start with something else, and then they'll start to negotiate it. All the while, the rest of us are dealing with our own business. And then people will come and ask us, well, how's that going? Well, we don't know. It hasn't come out of committee yet. 3/4 of the legislature passes. 3/4 of the time that we're down there passes, and then they go ahead and they slap a budget, an omnibus budget, down. And they effectively say, despite the fact that you're managing all the bills in business for your district, and you're in the heart or the heat of legislative duties between the Senate and the legislature and trying to account for all the other business, go ahead and try to read this. But oh, by the way, even if you do spend the time to read it, even if you do spend the time to really dig in deep and understand it, if you want to make an amendment to it, just realize your amendment's probably not going to be accepted because we've pretty much already agreed to this before we submitted it to you. So now what you have is a bunch of representation and a lot of people not being represented because their legislators are not allowed to deal with it. That's why I've advocated for a two-point system to fund it first. Number one, you take the educational dollars and you put it into its own budget, and then you mandate that all of the legislature has to take care of that item of business before any other business is done in the State House. And that way everybody is focused on it. Now, what would you get out of that, regardless of the Republican and Democratic talking points? You would get economies of scale and transparency and accountability that we've never seen before. Because since the entire body of the legislature is focused on it, you can start to carve up bipartisan groups. This group, you go tackle teacher COLAs. This group, you go tackle class size reduction. This group, okay, you go tackle XYZ, top-down mandates. Okay, and how about how about you take people that have an industry background in revenue growth and put them on how are we going to get additional funding sources for this as well.
It sounds like you're talking about two legislative sessions almost.
No, I'm not.
Well, one that's focused on this, and then one that's focused.
Here's what you
inside-
get. Here's what you get right now. And then we saw this happen in 2013. Okay, they waited 3/4 of the time, then they submitted the budget. Nobody could agree upon it. And then what happened? Special session after special
That's what I'm
session.
getting at. We already do two sessions. Two sessions long.
Well, okay, I guess you could say it that way, but I would look at it differently. If in fact all of us are focused on it up front, every one of us is now going to be held accountable. Keep in mind, 80% of the representation gets a free pass and it gets to punt on this issue. Because if you come and talk to me and I'm not on that committee, I can say, well, that's not what I would have negotiated, but that's just what they did.
Do you not-
Instead, I would be held accountable by you. You'd be able to come down every day that is continually ongoing and we're still addressing the funding for that. You'd see it in the paper. All that stuff would be negotiated in the open, in committee. And then you'd be able to come back and say, you know what, I don't like where that topic is going. I don't think that's the right way. This is what I would like for you to propose. Every one of us would be incentivized to knock that one out really fast and get it funded with our first dollar.
I guess that's why I'm calling it its own session. You'd say this month is
First order
we
business.
have to get it done. Yeah, that's what I was saying. I'm not talking about changing the Constitution necessarily.
Sure.
I do want to ask a question, just to make sure I'm understanding what you mean. When you say 75 or 80% of the legislators are not involved in that process,
Yeah,
what you mean is it's all done in the committee caucus.
behind closed doors.
Um,
Not the
do
committee
you-
caucuses, the leadership of the committees negotiate those.
but
For
there
example.
are education committees that meet and contribute to that discussion.
Okay, well, let me explain it to you from the transportation side, which is its own budget. Okay, the leadership of that took the governor's proposal, and the leadership of both the Democratic Chair Clibbert, along with Representative Orcutt, who's the ranking member from the Republican side, they get together, and the leadership, they go negotiate that, regardless of what we're doing in committee. That's negotiated by them. The rest of us are excluded from that process. So even the other committee members, if you're not in leadership on it, are not purview to those conversations, even if you're on committee. And as a result, again, 80% of the representation is not involved in that process, which means 80% of the people are not having their voices heard when it comes to education.
And is it a common feeling to even within your own party's leadership that is it a sense that they are not listening to you and taking the advice of the rest of their caucus?
I don't think that's the case, because look at what
That's
you
what-
have. You have competing priorities now. Because that's going on behind closed doors while they've opened the gates to everyone else's bill of interest. Thousands of bills get dropped on day one. And then we have to manage all those. Everyone is focused on their own area of influence, or what's in front of them right there. So if you have a bill, you're trying to walk that through, you're trying to negotiate and talk to other people to get them to co-sponsor it, you're trying to get additional support for it. And everyone's distracted. The entire nature for how this is managed down there is not efficient. And if you really want to talk about how we're going to fund education, make it efficient first, and we don't have to waste so many dollars. We know that dollars are being wasted in education. This is a common sense solution to bring focus to this issue. Get everybody focused on it at the same time, so that you don't have competing interests at the same time.
Okay. No, that's good. It's structural change is what you're talking about, it sounds like. This came up the last time, and we didn't get into it with this much depth, but if I remember right, your position was you can't separate these things out because there are budget issues that cross over with one another. But am I understanding you correctly?
That's part of it. I also think this idea of efficiencies is asking 147 elected people to get involved is probably not true. That's why we have a committee structure, is so that people do have areas of expertise. And I guess I just had a very different experience than you did in my time in the legislature. I was working very closely with my committee leadership to be pushing through issues, working to find savings in the ferries, to work on the Tacoma Narrows Bridge and find dollars to save there, and had a big impact on the budget. And so I guess maybe it's the initiative you take and the work that you do that makes a difference.
Okay.
But I had a very different experience working through the process. The committee chairs negotiate the line item by line item to some extent, but that comes back to the committee, and we all had amendments. I believe on the transportation budget in the Senate, we had amendments A through O, if I remember correctly, when it just got to the committee level of the transportation budget, before we even got to the floor, and as I recall, the floor was like A through Y. So the idea that we don't have input on it, again, I guess just a different experience and a different perspective, but I found that I had a number of impacts on that budget, and we're able
I would like
do
to
it.
really address that, because what he's attempting to do is leverage talking points that have no basis in fact. I mean, he's attempting to say that I didn't have initiative down there, but let's understand something.
Well, no.
He says
we were trying to get his perspective.
Well, his perspective
do you
was
feel
to-
like you have a voice? Did you feel? No, you explained it.
Well, we do have a voice, but everyone's, for me to say, and for him to just completely be oblivious to the fact that everyone else is focused on everything and that trying to get everyone to focus on it wouldn't work. I mean, he's telling you right now that he's completely whitewashing a potential opportunity to bring efficiencies down there because he can stand on a political talking point and try to make snide remarks and say that I wasn't focused on or wasn't involved in the legislation that was going on, which is absurd. I mean, he says that, well, he negotiated bridge tolls and he got, well, then why did the tolls go up under your watch? At the end of the day, I would say that's not very effective. He said that education, that he was involved in education. Well, it's still not fixed. Even after the 2013 session, the Supreme Court came back and said they didn't do enough. And then finally, if he was really involved, then why did they have to keep going back to special session after special session?
I'm sorry, I got to stop right now because I have to stop you guys from just taking shots at each other because what I want is Nathan to answer the question.
I was trying to.
Yeah, answer. Okay,
But you didn't answer.
you addressed the first
So-
part of as far as the structurally how it works through committee and your experience. That's all I wanted to know.
That's,
You gave me yours.
I believe,
you're
what
giving
I was
ours.
trying to share. And then
But-
your real
but then-
question, as I recall, was
then-
what should
well-
the Supreme Court do, right?
True. I guess there's still two questions I'd like you to answer. One of them is, what do you think the mechanism would be to make sure this happens? Like, what do you think would satisfy? If we're going to say, Supreme Court, you need to leave these guys alone, what's the mechanism? Jesse's saying, if you have a structure that says it has to be done by this time, that's a mechanism that says it has to be done. What do you think the mechanism is to make sure you're held to doing this job?
Well, and I want to be clear that the big difference here is I support the Supreme Court in their beliefs of interpreting the law. That the check and balance is that the Supreme Court's job is to implement the laws, and what they're basing that decision off of is a law that was passed by the legislature defining adequate funding, and that the legislature then didn't meet its own law that it passed. So I think that's actually the check and balance. There's an argument to be made about retention of jurisdiction and all that, but that's different than them making a ruling that says you failed to meet the standards of your own laws. That's the psychiatric boarding issue, and I guess the solution to me, and I'm going,
No,
I'm with you. That was a short 20-second, not a 3-minute. Come on now. But the reality is, I think the psychiatric boarding is elusive, and this is what I continue to share with legislators and community members. As I said, look at the psychiatric boarding ruling. There's the same issue. The state has failed in its fundamental obligation to fund a requirement, one that has to do with constitutional liberties and deprivation of rights of freedom. And at the end of the day, the consequences of that were that in ruling that you would not be able to single bed cert somebody, people who were suicidal, homicidal, or gravely disabled were to be released to the street. Lives hung in the balance with that decision. People I care for every day. And it wasn't a 5-year rollout. It wasn't a 5-day rollout. The initial interpretation was I was working Thursday in the year when the ruling came out, and on Friday they were going to start releasing people. If you don't think the Supreme Court is serious about the legislature doing its job, I hope that opens the eyes of a lot of legislators. Because lives hung in the balance. How do you think they feel about a budget and dollars? And so I think when you ask what's the solution, they've done it before. When the state didn't pass a constitutional budget in the 1950s, they threw out the budget for 9 days. And I think that's the hammer. They will invalidate a budget that does not meet the constitutional requirements of funding basic education as defined by the legislature in the law. And if you invalidate the budget, you don't cherry pick out the education budget. It's the entire operating budget, which has ramifications across the state. And that's the hammer that the Supreme Court, I think, has, is to really just say, July 1, when you need a new budget, if it doesn't meet the standards of education, you won't have a budget, and 70,000 people potentially get a pink slip again if the legislature doesn't do its job.
Okay, and so then you personally, if you're in that seat next year, what are you doing to make sure that it does happen? What type of either cuts or changes need to happen to make this real this year?
I think it's a combination of cuts and it's a combination of revenue, and we've talked about this last time. There are efficiencies to be found in the budget. There are savings to be done. There are programs that we're probably going to have to look at closing, to be quite honest. And unfortunately, a lot of them land in healthcare. Because when you look at the budget, remember, education is already 55% of the budget when you include preschool all the way up to higher ed. There's not a lot left. And when you're talking about carving out up to $7 billion more for education if the class size initiative passes, a lot of that comes from healthcare, the environment, social services, and jails. I mean, those are the 4 areas we have. So we need to find savings in those programs wherever we can. You know, we need to work with education to make sure that 55% is being used efficiently. Administration is one area that I think is a little top heavy, and we can look at making some cuts and realignments. The other issue, I think, though, is the revenue side of things we'll have to look at. You know, the state is, anyone can look at it, you know, the state budget has not kept up with the percentage of GDP. It's backslid since 2000 from 7.5% of state GDP to 5.5% of state GDP. So while our absolute dollars over time have generally gone up, the percentage and relative to the population and the economic costs of the state have gone down. That's a fundamental structural problem that I think we're going to have to work to fix in the state. And we need people that are committed to working on those solutions and willing to, you know, be engaged in this process to make sure that those are happening.
Actually, I want to ask you more.